Chapter 12. The Black Elephant's Graveyard. Requiem awoke with a jolt as the elephant dropped him on the dusty ground. A titanic crash and a rush of billowing dust was followed by the reverberation of two light thuds. The grey haze soon condensed to a thick ash, forcing Requiem to roll onto all fours, coughing and spluttering as he reached for air. Even though this new cloud was as impenetrable as the darkest night, Requiem knew that his friends were nearby. Only Gio's great bulk could displace enough dust to suffocate a man. Requiem saw no other alternative. Pushing his hands deep into the dust, he absorbed the particles around him. Ice crept over his hands and legs, fixing him to the spot, before a great boom resounded through the air. Requiem thrust out the energy he had converted. Like a detonating bomb, an invisible ring of force chased away the dust and shattered the ice. Looking up, Requiem fell back on his knees and raised his hands in dismay as more dust filled the vacuum of the energy's wake. Thankfully, however, this lingering dust was easier to breathe in and, although difficult to see through conventionally, presented less of a problem for those who could see energy. Straight ahead, Requiem identified the cool blue, pulsing wave of Uracil. To him, a person appeared much like they did to anyone else in shape and outline, but, instead of seeing distinct colours and textures, their clothes and bodies were black. It was how their energy flowed within them that made everyone unique. Uracil's energy always pulsed cool and calm from head to toe, leaving random crackles and sparks behind. These were his eccentricities and genius. No matter how flustered he may appear on the outside, Requiem could see that Uracil was always controlled, always thinking, as he meandered back and forth across the line between genius and eccentric. To his left, the fire and tornado of Freya was unmistakable. Freya was a walking supernova of passion and brilliance. Right now, a blaze of red swirled and danced all over her body, leaping from her like solar flares. Her head kept the fire under control most of the time, but the tornado that emanated from her heart could wreak havoc. You just had to be sure you were on Freya's good side so as not to get burned by her flames in the moments her heart won over her head. It was easy for Requiem to see why Freya and Uracil got on so well, even if it was difficult for others to understand. The chaotic energy of Freya was well balanced by the controlled pulse of Uracil, and both were generally ruled by their heads, albeit in different fashions. Despite his great size, Gio was more difficult to see. He was always in tune with his surroundings, and often blended with the background. Only when Gio was called upon to act would he bring himself to the foreground, where, depending on his surroundings and situation, he would become a blaze of fire, a rush of green wind, a torrent of water, a solid block of brown earth, or a mixture of any or all. Now, Requiem watched as Uracil's steady blue pulse staggered around in the dust. It didn't get far until it tripped and landed on something nigh on invisible, even to Requiem, and then he knew he had found Gio. His concerns for his friend's whereabouts eased. Requiem collapsed onto his back and watched the black elephants as they left in a trail of thick grey dust. He had no need to use his unique vision, as their vibrant white tusks gave them all the shape they needed in the cloud. Choking on the dust, Gio spluttered. "Where are we? And why do I feel so heavy all of a sudden?" Standing, dusting himself off and straightening his suit, Requiem spoke into the silence. "The Black Elephant Graveyard." "Great, I'm glad we got here," replied Gio. "However, I think those hairless mammoths have broken me. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go any further. My back's killing me." Requiem shook his head. "No, that would be Uracil." Gio twisted his head like an owl to see behind him. His eyes met with a repentant-looking Uracil, who tried his best to grin and look innocent. "Why, you, I may have some insulation, but that does not mean you can use my squishiness as a resting spot. Get off!" Geo thrust himself to his feet, hurling Uracil far behind him to crash once more into a heap with a complementary plume of dust. Geo brushed clean his great biceps and looked around as the dust finally subsided. They were in the darkness beneath the rainbow, and no gold shone there. Geo felt itchy, as though he had sand between his toes. Looking down, he watched as his great sandaled feet sank into the thick grey powder formed from centuries of decaying elephant bones. Freya shivered as goosebumps ravaged her body. She began to adjust her top to a longer length to accommodate for the fact that they were now entirely engulfed in darkness. Even the rainbow that had led them there was a mere shadow of its former brilliance above them. It wasn't just the cold that Freya was feeling. As she looked around at the scattered elephant bones littering the landscape, she could feel the last of her warmth drain away and cold despair take its place. Strangely, the sight of Uracil despondently collapsed in the dust gave Freya hope. A little bit of warmth crept back to her, and, even though she hurried to Uracil as if in alarm, on the inside she was smiling. With Uracil floundering, Freya rushing to his aid, Geo stretching his back, and Requiem making patterns in the dust with his foot, no one was speaking, and this made them realise just how unsettling a silence had engulfed them. The call of the wild that surrounded the graveyard could not be heard, even though such an abundance of life could only have been a few metres away. Once Freya had pulled him to his feet, Uracil, astute as ever, made an observation. "Interesting. All these skeletons, but not one tusk." "I can't think for 1 minute that anyone would be mad enough to come here to collect them," said Freya as she surveyed the woeful landscape. "Whatever the case, this is a sacred place, and we should be respectful." Geo was keen to remind people that although to them this was just another stop on their journey, to the elephants at least, this place held great meaning. This was apparently lost on Requiem, who was surprisingly cheery. He bounded over to Uracil with a beaming smile, eager to advance. "Okay, Uracil, we've made it to the graveyard. Now what?" Sneezing on the dust, Uracil looked at Requiem with raw eyes and a runny nose. "Well, somewhere around here will be the entrance to the library." "Wasn't the book any more specific, Uracil?" "For such a useful book, it's pretty sketchy on details, you know," quipped Geo. "Let me check," replied Uracil, as he wiped his nose with a purple hanky and rummaged around his pockets for the book. After pulling out a potted plant, an egg timer, and, worryingly, a book entitled How to Boil the Perfect Egg and 101 Other Practical Tips, Uracil finally materialised the Book of Morpheus and Minerva and opened it. "That's odd," he said. "What?" asked Requiem warily as he cast his eyes around. "The book. The pages keep on rewriting themselves over and over again. Each time is something new. It's as if it's telling us everything about everything." Geo folded his arms and looked down at Uracil. "Great. When it gets to the part that says, 'When you're in the elephant graveyard, do this,' stop it, will you?" "I don't think he'll have to," said Freya as she backed into the safety of the group. In front of them, an upturned rib cage, which was unnaturally large even for one of the black elephants, slowly began to open. Within it, an enormous elephant skull, tusks and all, began to rise from the ground, shattering the silence and causing the very air to tremble. Dust bellowed out of the hole that once would have housed a great trunk, covering the group in a fine grey film. All stood in silence, just staring at the spectacle in front of them. None of them had any words, until Uracil voiced what was undoubtedly going through everyone's mind. "Impressive." Following Freya's lead, Geo dropped out of his awestruck stance to huddle up with the group and, with a twinge of fear, highlighted their new situation. "Oh, that's not all. Look!" A new noise unsettled the silence, and another spectacle filled the darkness before them. Pangs of fear washed over the group as bones clinked, cracked, and snapped together to form joints, limbs and bodies. All around them, the skeletons of elephants were rising. Everyone longed for the ignorance of the silent darkness as they faced a veritable army of giant skeleton elephants, which began stomping over to the great head with military precision to form a corridor. The dust settled, and the eerie silence came back to swallow the noise, leaving the four standing at the far end of a long skeletal corridor. Stunned, Requiem broke the silence. "Right, well, I'd hazard a guess that it's this way then." "Gio, you first," snapped Freya as she tightened her grip on Urasil. "Why me?" "Because you don't want to wear spandex to my funeral." "Good point." Gingerly, Gio led the way, followed by Freya, Urasil, and lastly Requiem, who looked at each elephant in amazement as he passed. Flicking the leg of one of the elephants, Requiem declared enthusiastically, "You know, these things are great. Akuma would love an army of giant skeleton elephants." At the word Akuma, all elephants looked down at them. Piercing glints of light shone out of their tusk cavities. "Oh dear, Requiem, what have you done?" Gio's twinge of fear was fast becoming panic. Suddenly, trademark brilliant white tusks of purest ivory thrust out of every elephant's head. Gio had to breathe in quickly and stand sideways to avoid being skewered, whilst Urasil dove to the floor. Amidst the cracking ground and plumes of dust, the giant's skull slowly started to sink. The group had more pressing problems, however, as the skeleton corridor charged in for the kill. Freya clenched her fists by her side and prepared to stand her ground against a horde of undead beasts many times her size, before Urasil grabbed her ankle and pulled her to the ground. The charging elephant thrust a tusk into the dust, scarring the ground as it made its way to Freya, who managed to scrabble to one side and kick the tusk as it cut a swathe through the air. Such was the force of her kick that the ball of golden string rolled out of Freya's pocket and trailed along the ground as it caught the elephant's tusk. Her eyes wide and fearful, Freya dived for the string before it was trampled by a giant skeletal foot. "Urasil!" Freya shouted as she sat upright on her knees and threw him the string. Urasil feared for his life. Even the legs of the elephants were far larger than he was, and he felt certain he would snap like the twig Gio always compared him to if he didn't keep his wits about him. String was not something he felt was helpful at this point. "What am I supposed to do with this? This is no time to be playing cat's cradle." He didn't have to wait long for an answer. A roar so mighty that the dust of the floor rose into a tidal wave and shattered two of the elephants, blasted out from the darkness and tore towards them. Gio rushed forwards. Reaching Urasil first, he flung him over his shoulder before weaving over to Requiem. Paying no respect to Requiem's sense of decorum, he scooped him off the ground to hold him under his other arm. Kneeling on the ground, Freya now had both the tidal wave and Gio bearing down on her. Realising that some kind of horrific impact was inevitable, she curled up into a tight ball. Gio yelled and leapt high into the air. Holding Requiem and Urasil, one in each hand, he threw them down next to Freya before landing on them all to shield them with his mighty body, and not a moment too soon. The tidal wave of dust smashed into Gio's side, but, like the mountain he was, he remained unmoved as bones and tusks flew into the air and splintered. Gio held on tight to his friends as he could still hear the sounds of scattering and splintering bones. Lifting his head, he could see that everything around him had been decimated. A fight was being waged in the darkness around them, but it was impossible to say if the new assailant was friend or foe.